Question 1. The performance metrics show that while in situ chemical oxidation (ISCO) achieved a rapid initial reduction in contaminant concentrations, bioremediation has demonstrated a more consistent and sustained decrease over a longer monitoring period, and soil vapor extraction (SV) has shown significant removal of volatile organic compounds but has plateaued in recent months. Considering these varying results and the need for a long-term, cost-effective solution that meets regulatory cleanup standards, which remedial technology selection best reflects professional best practices for a site contaminated with a mix of petroleum hydrocarbons and chlorinated solvents? Option A. Select soil vapor extraction (SV), as it has already removed a substantial amount of volatile contaminants, and the plateau indicates that remaining concentrations are below acceptable risk levels. Option B. Recommend a combination of bioremediation and soil vapor extraction (SV) to address both the dissolved phase and volatile components of the contamination, even if the initial performance metrics for each individually are not definitively superior across all parameters. Option C. Choose in situ chemical oxidation (ISCO) because of its rapid initial results, assuming that the initial reduction is indicative of its overall superiority, and that further monitoring will confirm its long-term success. Option D. Prioritize bioremediation due to its sustained effectiveness and potential for cost efficiency in the long term, while acknowledging the need for continued monitoring and potential supplemental treatments if specific contaminants persist. The correct answer is D. Prioritize bioremediation due to its sustained effectiveness and potential for cost efficiency in the long term, while acknowledging the need for continued monitoring and potential supplemental treatments if specific contaminants persist. Explanation: the performance metrics show varying degrees of effectiveness for different remedial technologies applied to a contaminated site. This scenario is professionally challenging because selecting the most appropriate remedial technology requires a nuanced understanding of site-specific conditions, regulatory requirements, and the long-term efficacy of each option, rather than relying solely on initial performance data. A certified environmental site assessor must balance technical feasibility, cost-effectiveness, and compliance with environmental regulations to ensure the chosen technology achieves the desired cleanup goals and protects human health and the environment. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it involves a comprehensive evaluation that considers not only the reported performance metrics, but also the underlying mechanisms of each technology, their suitability for the specific contaminants and site geology, potential for long-term effectiveness, and compliance with all applicable regulations, such as those outlined in the U.S. EPA's guidance documents for remedial action selection. This holistic assessment ensures that the chosen technology is technically sound, environmentally protective, and economically viable for the long term, aligning with the ethical obligation to provide competent and responsible environmental assessment services. An incorrect approach that prioritizes the technology with the highest reported short-term reduction in contaminant levels, without considering the potential for rebound or the generation of secondary waste streams, fails to meet the regulatory requirement for sustainable and effective remediation. This could lead to ongoing environmental risks and potential future liabilities. Another incorrect approach that focuses solely on the lowest upfront cost, disregarding the long-term operational and maintenance expenses or the potential for incomplete remediation, violates the principle of achieving the best possible environmental outcome within a reasonable economic framework. Furthermore, selecting a technology based on its widespread use in similar sites, without a thorough site-specific investigation, ignores the critical regulatory mandate to tailor remediation strategies to the unique characteristics of the contaminated site, potentially leading to ineffective cleanup and noncompliance. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough site characterization, followed by the identification of all potential remedial technologies. Each technology should then be evaluated against a set of criteria including technical feasibility, effectiveness for the specific contaminants and site conditions, regulatory compliance, cost both capital and O&M, and long-term protectiveness. This systematic process, often guided by regulatory frameworks like the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation and Liability Act, CERCLA, and its associated guidance, ensures that the selected technology is the most appropriate and defensible choice. Question 2. Risk assessment procedures indicate that a commercial property was previously occupied by a dry cleaning business approximately 30 years ago and is currently a retail store. The Certified Environmental Site Assessor, CESA, is tasked with conducting a Phase I Environmental Site Assessment, ESSA. Which of the following approaches best aligns with regulatory compliance and professional best practices for identifying potential environmental concerns? Option A. Dismiss the historical dry cleaning use as a concern because the current use is a retail store and no immediate visual signs of contamination are present. Option B. Conduct a thorough review of historical records, including chain of title, aerial photographs, and Sanborn maps, alongside a site reconnaissance, to identify potential recognized environmental conditions, REC, and determine if further investigation is warranted. Option C. Immediately recommend a Phase II ESA due to the historical dry cleaning use, without further investigation. Option D. Rely solely on readily available online environmental databases to assess the historical use and potential risks. Correct answer is C. Immediately recommend a Phase II ESA due to the historical dry cleaning use, without further investigation. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the Certified Environmental Site Assessor, CESA, to navigate the nuanced requirements of identifying and evaluating potential environmental concerns at commercial property. The challenge lies in distinguishing between historical land use that might have posed a risk and definitive evidence of a recognized environmental condition, REC, that necessitates further investigation under the relevant regulatory framework. Assessor must exercise sound professional judgment to avoid both over-investigation, leading to unnecessary costs and delays, and under-investigation, leading to potential liability and noncompliance. The pressure to provide a definitive assessment within a reasonable timeframe further exacerbates this challenge. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough review of historical records, including previous ownership, zoning, and aerial photographs, to identify past uses of the property and adjacent sites that could have led to the release of hazardous substances or petroleum products. This is followed by a site reconnaissance to observe current conditions and identify any visible signs of contamination or past activities. Crucially, the CESA must then evaluate the findings against the criteria for a recognized environmental condition, REC, as defined by the governing regulatory standards, e.g., ASTM E1527 in the U.S. If RECs are identified, the next step is to recommend further investigation, such as a Phase II ESA, to confirm or refute the presence of contamination and assess its extent and impact. This systematic, evidence-based approach aligns with the regulatory mandate to identify potential environmental liabilities and inform decision-making for property transactions or development. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to immediately recommend a Phase II ESA based solely on the presence of a former dry cleaning business on the property, without first conducting a comprehensive historical review and site reconnaissance to gather sufficient evidence to establish a REC. This fails to adhere to the tiered investigation process mandated by regulatory frameworks, which requires a preliminary assessment to identify potential concerns before proceeding to more intrusive and costly investigations. It represents a failure to exercise professional judgment and could lead to unnecessary expenditure and delays for the client. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the former dry cleaning business as a potential concern without any historical research or site observation, simply because the current use is a retail store. This overlooks the fundamental principle of Phase I ESAs, which is to identify historical and or current uses and conditions that may indicate the presence of RECs. The regulatory framework requires a proactive identification of potential risks, not a passive acceptance of current land use as indicative of a clean site. This approach demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to comply with the investigative requirements. A third incorrect approach would be to rely solely on readily available online databases without conducting a thorough review of chain of title records, building permits, or Sanborn maps. While databases can be a useful starting point, they are not exhaustive and may not capture all relevant historical information. The regulatory standards for Phase I ESAs typically require a more in-depth review of historical sources to ensure a comprehensive understanding of the property's past. This approach risks missing critical information that could indicate a REC, thereby failing to meet the professional standard of care. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach phase IESAs with a structured methodology that prioritizes evidence-based decision-making. This involves 1. Clearly defining the scope of work based on regulatory requirements and client objectives. 2. Systematically gathering and reviewing all relevant historical and site information. 3. Critically evaluating the gathered information against established criteria for RECs. 4. Clearly documenting all findings, conclusions, and recommendations. And 5. Communicating these findings effectively to the client, explaining the implications and recommended next steps. This process ensures compliance, minimizes liability, and provides the client with the necessary information for informed decision-making. Question 3. Stakeholder feedback indicates a need to optimize the corrective action process for a recent release from a solid waste management unit, focusing on efficiency and long-term effectiveness. Which of the following approaches best aligns with process optimization principles and regulatory expectations for corrective action? Option A. Implementing a phased corrective action strategy that begins with source control and containment, followed by a detailed evaluation of cost-effective and technically sound remediation technologies based on site-specific data, and includes adaptive management based on ongoing monitoring. Option B. Prioritizing the complete removal of all contaminated soil to the maximum extent technically feasible, even if it exceeds regulatory cleanup standards and incurs significant, disproportionate costs. Option C. Pursuing the most technologically advanced and comprehensive remediation solution without a thorough cost-benefit analysis or consideration of simpler, equally effective alternatives. Option D. Selecting the lowest cost remediation technology immediately available, regardless of its long-term effectiveness or potential for future releases, to satisfy immediate regulatory pressure. The correct answer is A. Implementing a phased corrective action strategy that begins with source control and containment, followed by a detailed evaluation of cost-effective and technically sound remediation technologies based on site-specific data, and includes adaptive management based on ongoing monitoring. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate need for effective containment and remediation of a solid waste release with the long-term sustainability and cost-effectiveness of the corrective action strategy. Stakeholders, including regulatory agencies, community members, and the responsible party, often have differing priorities and perspectives on what constitutes an acceptable outcome. Regulatory compliance is paramount, but achieving it through the most efficient and environmentally sound means necessitates a deep understanding of the applicable regulations and the technical feasibility of various corrective action options. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a phased, data-driven strategy that aligns with the principles of process optimization. This involves thoroughly characterizing the release, evaluating a range of technically feasible and cost-effective remedial technologies, and selecting an approach that not only meets regulatory standards, but also minimizes long-term environmental impact and liability. This iterative process, informed by ongoing monitoring and adaptive management, ensures that resources are used judiciously and that the corrective action is effective and sustainable. This aligns with the overarching goals of environmental protection and responsible resource management, as mandated by environmental regulations. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the cheapest immediate solution without adequate technical evaluation or long-term impact assessment would represent a regulatory failure. This could lead to ineffective remediation, requiring further costly interventions and potentially violating permit conditions or cleanup standards. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes a complex, high-cost technology without a clear demonstration of its superiority over simpler, more cost-effective alternatives would be an ethical and professional failure. This could result in the inefficient use of resources and potentially fail to achieve the desired environmental outcome. A third incorrect approach that disregards stakeholder input or fails to adequately communicate the rationale behind the chosen corrective action plan could lead to community opposition and regulatory scrutiny, undermining the overall success of the remediation effort. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a comprehensive understanding of the regulatory requirements and the site-specific conditions. This involves a thorough site characterization to define the nature and extent of the release. Subsequently, a systematic evaluation of potential corrective action technologies should be conducted, considering technical feasibility, cost-effectiveness, potential environmental impacts, and long-term performance. Engaging with stakeholders throughout this process is crucial for building consensus and ensuring that all concerns are addressed. The chosen corrective action plan should be clearly documented, with defined performance objectives and a robust monitoring program to track progress and allow for adaptive management if necessary. Question 4. Investigation of a former industrial facility reveals a complex history of chemical manufacturing. Preliminary historical records indicate the presence of various solvents and heavy metals, but the exact locations and extent of past disposal practices are not clearly documented. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the investigative requirements and best practices under CERCLA for a certified environmental site assessor? Option A. Immediately initiate extensive, broad-spectrum soil and groundwater sampling across the entire property to capture all potential contamination, regardless of historical data or site observations. Option B. Focus the investigation solely on current land use and potential impacts to nearby residential areas, disregarding historical disposal practices at the facility itself. Option C. Conclude the investigation based on the limited historical records, assuming no significant contamination exists beyond what is explicitly stated, and forego site reconnaissance or sampling. Option D. Conduct a phased site investigation, beginning with a thorough review of all available historical documents, site reconnaissance, interviews, and a targeted sampling plan based on initial findings to characterize potential contamination and identify potential responsible parties. The correct answer is D. Conduct a phased site investigation, beginning with a thorough review of all available historical documents, site reconnaissance, interviews, and a targeted sampling plan based on initial findings to characterize potential contamination and identify potential responsible parties. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge for certified environmental site assessors, CESA under CERCLA, determining the extent of a release and identifying potentially responsible parties, PRP, when historical records are incomplete or ambiguous. The difficulty lies in balancing the need for thorough investigation to protect human health and the environment with the practical constraints of time and resources. While adhering strictly to CERCLA liability framework, the assessor must navigate the complexities of identifying releases or threatened releases and understanding the implications of hazardous substances as defined by the statute. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly aligns with the investigative and reporting mandates of CERCLA. It prioritizes a systematic, evidence-based methodology that begins with a thorough review of available historical and environmental data. This includes site reconnaissance, interviews, and a review of regulatory records to identify potential sources, pathways, and receptors of contamination. The subsequent phased approach to sampling and analysis, guided by the initial findings, is crucial for cost-effectively characterizing the nature and extent of contamination. This phased approach ensures that investigations are targeted and efficient, avoiding unnecessary expenditure, while still gathering sufficient data to inform decisions about remediation and PRP identification. This methodology is consistent with EPA guidance and best practices for site assessments under CERCLA, emphasizing due diligence and a scientifically sound approach to environmental risk management. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach fails by prematurely concluding the investigation based on limited historical data without conducting site reconnaissance or sampling. This is a regulatory failure because CERCLA requires a comprehensive assessment to identify actual or threatened releases. Ethically, it represents a dereliction of duty to adequately protect human health and the environment. Another incorrect approach is to initiate extensive, broad-spectrum sampling across the entire property without a clear hypothesis or preliminary data to guide the sampling strategy. This is professionally inefficient and potentially violates the spirit of CERCLA cost recovery provisions by incurring unnecessary expenses. While thoroughness is important, it must be balanced with a logical, data-driven investigative plan. A third incorrect approach involves focusing solely on current land use and ignoring historical activities that may have introduced hazardous substances. This is a significant regulatory failure, as CERCLA liability provisions extend to past owners and operators who arranged for disposal or treatment of hazardous substances. Ethically, it fails to identify all potential sources of contamination and therefore all potential PRPs, leaving the site and surrounding environment at risk. Professional reasoning. CESA must employ a structured, iterative decision-making process. This begins with understanding the specific regulatory requirements of CERCLA, including definitions of hazardous substances, releases, and PRPs. The assessor should then develop a conceptual site model, CSM, based on initial data gathering, which guides the subsequent phases of investigation. This model should be refined as new data becomes available. Professional judgment is critical in determining the appropriate level of investigation, balancing the need for comprehensive data with resource limitations and the statutory objectives of CERCLA. Continuous communication with the client and regulatory agencies, where applicable, is also essential to ensure alignment and manage expectations. Question 5. What factors determine the appropriate scope and reporting of an environmental site assessment when a client requests that certain potentially negative findings be downplayed or omitted, specifically within the context of state-specific environmental laws and regulations governing site assessments? Option A. The prevailing market rates for environmental site assessments and the assessor's desire to secure future business from the client. Option B. The client's stated budget for the assessment and their desired outcome for the property's future use. Option C. The explicit requirements and mandates of the applicable state's environmental statutes and administrative regulations, alongside professional ethical standards for environmental site assessors. Option D. The assessor's personal opinion on the severity of the potential findings and the likelihood of regulatory enforcement. The correct answer is C. The explicit requirements and mandates of the applicable state's environmental statutes and administrative regulations, alongside professional ethical standards for environmental site assessors. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because the Certified Environmental Site Assessor, CESA, is caught between potentially conflicting obligations, fulfilling their professional duty to accurately assess a site according to established standards and responding to a client's directive that may seek to minimize perceived negative findings. The core of the challenge lies in maintaining professional integrity and adherence to regulatory requirements when faced with client pressure. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes adherence to the specific state's environmental laws and regulations, which are the foundational documents governing site assessments. CESA's primary responsibility is to conduct the assessment in a manner that is compliant with all applicable state statutes and administrative rules. This includes accurately documenting all findings, regardless of their potential impact on the client's interests, and reporting them transparently. This approach upholds the ethical obligation of honesty and diligence inherent in professional certification and ensures the integrity of the environmental assessment process, which is crucial for public health and safety and informed decision-making by regulatory bodies and future property owners. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the client's desired outcome, without regard for state-specific regulations, represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. It violates the CESA duty to conduct an objective and compliant assessment. This could lead to the submission of incomplete or misleading information to regulatory agencies, potentially resulting in fines, legal liabilities for both the assessor and the client, and a failure to identify and address environmental risks. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes expediency over thoroughness by glossing over potential issues similarly undermines the purpose of the assessment and violates the professional standard of care. This failure to conduct a comprehensive investigation as mandated by state regulations can have severe environmental and financial consequences. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the applicable state-specific environmental laws and regulations. The CESA must first identify all relevant statutes, rules, and guidance documents governing the scope of the assessment. They should then critically evaluate the client's request against these regulatory requirements. If a client's directive appears to conflict with regulatory obligations or professional standards, the CESA must communicate these concerns clearly and professionally to the client, explaining the regulatory basis for their findings and the potential consequences of noncompliance. The ultimate decision must be to proceed in a manner that ensures full regulatory compliance and upholds the integrity of the assessment, even if it means disagreeing with the client's preferred outcome. Question 6. When evaluating an industrial facility that has a history of discharging wastewater, what is the most appropriate initial step for a certified environmental site assessor to determine the facility's current National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System (NPDES) permitting requirements? Option A. Assume that historical discharge data accurately reflects current regulatory obligations and continue operations under those historical parameters until a violation is identified. Option B. Focus solely on the historical discharge data to understand past environmental impacts, disregarding the need for an active NPDES permit for present operations. Option C. Obtain and thoroughly review the facility's existing NPDES permit, if one exists, to understand its current terms, conditions, and discharge limits, and assess if current or proposed operations necessitate a modification or a new application. Option D. Immediately begin the process of applying for a new NPDES permit, without first investigating the facility's current permit status or operational changes. The correct answer is C. Obtain and thoroughly review the facility's existing NPDES permit, if one exists, to understand its current terms, conditions, and discharge limits, and assess if current or proposed operations necessitate a modification or a new application. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge for certified environmental site assessors, CESA, when dealing with existing industrial facilities that have a history of discharges. The core difficulty lies in interpreting the scope and applicability of the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System (NPDES) permit in the context of historical operations versus current or proposed activities. A CESA must navigate the complexities of permit renewals, modifications, and the potential for legacy contamination to influence permit requirements. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly addresses the regulatory requirements for NPDES permit renewals and modifications under the Clean Water Act, CWA. It emphasizes obtaining and thoroughly reviewing the existing permit, understanding its terms and conditions, and assessing whether current or proposed operations necessitate a permit modification or a new permit application. This proactive and compliant approach ensures that the facility operates within the bounds of federal environmental law, preventing potential violations and associated penalties. It also demonstrates due diligence in identifying potential environmental liabilities. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the historical discharge data without considering the current permit status is professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a misunderstanding of the CWA's permitting scheme, which requires active permits for ongoing discharges. Relying on historical data alone ignores the regulatory obligation to have a valid permit for present operations. Another incorrect approach that proposes to simply continue operations under the assumption that historical practices are grandfathered in is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. CWA does not include a grandfather clause for discharges. All point source discharges require an NPDES permit. This approach demonstrates a lack of understanding of fundamental environmental law and a disregard for compliance. A third incorrect approach that suggests seeking a new permit without first reviewing the existing one is inefficient and potentially misdirected. While a new permit might eventually be necessary, the first step in assessing an existing facility is to understand its current regulatory standing. This approach bypasses a crucial diagnostic step and could lead to unnecessary administrative burdens and delays. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic, regulatory-driven approach. First, identify the nature of the facility's operations and any potential point source discharges. Second, determine if an NPDES permit is required. If so, ascertain the status of any existing permit. Third, obtain and meticulously review the existing permit, paying close attention to discharge limits, monitoring requirements, and any special conditions. Fourth, evaluate current and proposed operations against the existing permit's terms. If there are discrepancies or changes, determine if a permit modification or a new application is necessary. Finally, consult relevant EPA or state environmental agency guidance, and if necessary, seek expert legal counsel to ensure full compliance. Question 7. Operational review demonstrates that a facility accumulates several drums of what appears to be spent solvent on site for an extended period, and the transporter who delivered them is not readily providing manifest documentation upon request. Which of the following best represents the initial and most critical step for the certified environmental site assessor to take in evaluating this situation under applicable U.S. EPA regulations? Option A. Focus on obtaining the manifest documentation from the transporter, as this is the primary indicator of regulatory compliance for waste shipments. Option B. Conduct a detailed waste characterization to determine if the spent solvent meets the definition of hazardous waste under RCRA and verify the generator's regulatory status. Option C. Advise the facility to immediately dispose of all accumulated drums to mitigate potential future penalties. Option D. Immediately issue a notice of violation for improper waste accumulation and transportation, citing potential RCRA violations. The correct answer is D. Immediately issue a notice of violation for improper waste accumulation and transportation, citing potential RCRA violations. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge for environmental site assessors, ESSA, where a facility's waste management practices appear to deviate from regulatory requirements. The challenge lies in accurately identifying the specific regulatory framework applicable to the waste streams and the facility's operations, and then determining if the observed practices constitute a violation or a permissible exception. The assessor must exercise careful judgment to avoid making unsubstantiated accusations while ensuring full compliance with environmental laws. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough investigation into the specific characteristics of the waste, the generator's classification, and the transporter's adherence to manifest requirements, all within the defined regulatory framework. This includes verifying if the waste is indeed hazardous under the applicable regulations, confirming the generator's status, e.g., large quantity, small quantity, or conditionally exempt small quantity generator, and ensuring the transporter is properly licensed and using the correct manifest documentation. This systematic verification ensures that the assessment is grounded in factual evidence and regulatory compliance, representing best professional practice by upholding the integrity of the environmental assessment process and adhering strictly to the law. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to immediately assume non-compliance based on a superficial observation of waste accumulation. This fails to account for potential exemptions or different regulatory classifications that might permit such accumulation under specific conditions. It also bypasses the critical step of verifying the waste's hazardous characteristics, which is fundamental to determining regulatory applicability. Another incorrect approach is to focus solely on the generator's perceived practices without investigating the transporter's role and documentation. The manifest system is a cornerstone of hazardous waste regulation, and any discrepancies or omissions by the transporter are significant regulatory failures. Ignoring this aspect provides an incomplete and potentially misleading assessment. A third incorrect approach is to rely on outdated or generic knowledge of waste management regulations without confirming the current, specific requirements applicable to the facility's location and waste types. Environmental regulations are dynamic, and failure to consult the most current and relevant legal framework constitutes a significant professional and regulatory failure, potentially leading to inaccurate conclusions and recommendations. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such situations by adopting a structured investigative process. This begins with identifying the relevant regulatory jurisdiction and its specific requirements for generators, transporters, and treatment, storage, and disposal facilities, TSDF. The next step is to gather all pertinent information about the waste stream, including its composition and quantity, and the facility's operational context. This is followed by a meticulous review of documentation, such as manifests, permits, and waste profiles, and direct observation of practices. Any observed deviations should be cross-referenced against the applicable regulations to determine compliance status. If non-compliance is identified, the assessment should clearly articulate the specific regulatory violations and recommend corrective actions. This systematic, evidence-based, and jurisdiction-specific approach ensures accuracy, professionalism, and adherence to legal and ethical standards. Question 8. The audit findings indicate that a facility generates a waste stream whose exact hazardous characteristics are not definitively documented, and the waste's origin suggests it may fall under RCRA Subtitle C regulations, Which of the following approaches best ensures compliance with RCRA waste management requirements? Option A. Advise the client to disregard the audit finding, as it pertains to waste characterization and focus solely on other aspects of the environmental site assessment. Option B. Initiate laboratory analysis to determine if the waste exhibits any of the characteristics of hazardous waste, ignitability, corrosivity, reactivity, toxicity, or if it meets the criteria for any listed hazardous wastes, and maintain thorough documentation of the process and results. Option C. Immediately classify the waste as hazardous based on its appearance and source, and implement stringent hazardous waste management protocols without further investigation. Option D. Assume the waste is non-hazardous due to the lack of explicit documentation, and proceed with standard waste management practices. The correct answer is B. Initiate laboratory analysis to determine if the waste exhibits any of the characteristics of hazardous waste, ignitability, corrosivity, reactivity, toxicity, or if it meets the criteria for any listed hazardous wastes, and maintain thorough documentation of the process and results. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the Certified Environmental Site Assessor, CESA, to interpret and apply the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, RCRA, to a situation involving potentially hazardous waste generation and management. The core challenge lies in distinguishing between hazardous and non-hazardous waste, which has significant implications for storage, treatment, disposal, and record-keeping requirements under RCRA. Assessor must exercise careful judgment to ensure compliance, protect human health and the environment, and avoid potential legal and financial liabilities for the client. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly addresses the ambiguity identified in the audit findings by initiating a systematic process to determine the waste's hazardous characteristics. This involves consulting the relevant RCRA regulations, specifically 40 CFR Part 261, to understand the criteria for hazardous waste identification, including characteristic wastes, ignitability, corrosivity, reactivity, toxicity, and listed wastes. By proposing laboratory analysis and thorough documentation, the CESA is proactively seeking definitive data to classify the waste accurately. This aligns with the RCRA goal of cradle-to-grave management of hazardous waste and demonstrates due diligence, a cornerstone of professional environmental assessment. It ensures that appropriate management standards are applied, preventing improper disposal and potential environmental contamination. An incorrect approach that assumes the waste is non-hazardous without proper characterization is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This bypasses the fundamental requirement of RCRA to identify and manage hazardous waste. It could lead to the improper disposal of hazardous materials, violating RCRA prohibitions, and potentially causing environmental harm and posing risks to human health. Ethically, it represents a failure to act in the best interest of the client and the public by not ensuring compliance with environmental laws. Another incorrect approach that involves immediately classifying the waste as hazardous based solely on its appearance or source, without the required testing or regulatory review, is also professionally unacceptable. While a conservative approach is sometimes warranted, RCRA mandates specific criteria for hazardous waste determination. Jumping to conclusions without evidence can lead to unnecessary costs and burdens for the client if the waste is, in fact, non-hazardous. It also fails to demonstrate the rigorous, data-driven assessment expected of Assessor. A third incorrect approach that suggests ignoring the audit finding and proceeding with the assessment as if no issue exists is a severe dereliction of professional duty. This demonstrates a lack of integrity and a disregard for regulatory compliance. It not only fails to address a critical environmental concern, but also exposes the CESA and the client to significant legal penalties and reputational damage. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Thoroughly understanding the audit findings and identifying the specific regulatory concern. 2. Consulting the applicable regulations, in this case, RCRA 40 CFR Part 261, to determine the legal requirements for waste characterization. 3. Evaluating the available information and identifying data gaps. 4. Proposing a scientifically sound and legally compliant method to fill those gaps, e.g., laboratory analysis process review. 5. Documenting all steps taken, findings, and decisions. 6. Communicating clearly with the client about the findings, proposed actions, and potential implications. Question 9. The efficiency study reveals that a proposed development project could be expedited by streamlining the environmental impact assessment process, potentially by focusing only on readily apparent physical changes to the site and minimizing consultation with external agencies, which approach best aligns with federal environmental impact assessment laws and professional ethical standards for an environmental site assessor. Option A. Rely primarily on historical environmental data for the region, assuming the proposed project's impacts will be similar to past developments, and bypass detailed site-specific impact analysis. Option B. Prioritize identifying only the most obvious physical alterations to the site, such as land clearing and construction footprints, and limit external agency consultation to only the most critical permit requirements. Option C. Focus the impact assessment on economic benefits and job creation, with a cursory review of potential environmental effects, and defer detailed environmental analysis to a later phase of the project. Option D. Conduct a comprehensive assessment of all potential direct, indirect, and cumulative environmental impacts, including ecological, human health, and socioeconomic factors, and engage in thorough consultation with relevant regulatory agencies and stakeholders throughout the process. The correct answer is D. Conduct a comprehensive assessment of all potential direct, indirect, and cumulative environmental impacts, including ecological, human health, and socioeconomic factors, and engage in thorough consultation with relevant regulatory agencies and stakeholders throughout the process. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an environmental site assessor to balance the need for efficient project timelines with the absolute imperative of adhering to federal environmental laws, specifically those governing impact assessment. The pressure to expedite a project can lead to shortcuts that compromise thoroughness, potentially resulting in overlooked environmental impacts, non-compliance, and significant legal and financial repercussions for the client. The assessor must exercise sound professional judgment to ensure that all regulatory requirements are met without undue delay, demonstrating a commitment to both environmental protection and client service. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a comprehensive and systematic review of the proposed project's potential environmental impacts, directly aligning with the principles and requirements of federal environmental impact assessment laws, such as the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, in the U.S. This approach prioritizes identifying all potential direct, indirect, and cumulative impacts on various environmental resources, air, water, soil, ecosystems, human health, etc. It necessitates engaging in a thorough data collection and analysis process, consulting with relevant stakeholders and regulatory agencies, and developing appropriate mitigation measures. This represents best professional practice because it ensures full compliance with federal mandates, promotes informed decision-making, and safeguards environmental integrity. Ethically, it upholds the assessor's responsibility to protect the environment and public welfare. Incorrect approach is analysis, an approach that focuses solely on identifying impacts that are immediately obvious or easily quantifiable, while neglecting potential indirect or cumulative effects, represents a significant regulatory failure. Federal impact assessment laws require a holistic view of environmental consequences, not just the most apparent ones. Ethically, this shortcut demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to uphold the assessor's professional duty to thoroughly evaluate all potential harm. Another incorrect approach would be to rely exclusively on historical data, without considering how the proposed project's unique characteristics might alter existing environmental conditions or create new impacts. Federal regulations often mandate an assessment of the *specific impacts of the proposed action, not just a general overview of past environmental states. This approach fails to meet the specificity required by impact assessment frameworks and could lead to a mischaracterization of risks. Finally, an approach that prioritizes speed by limiting stakeholder consultation or agency review, assuming their input is not critical, is a severe regulatory and ethical failure. Federal impact assessment processes are designed to incorporate public and agency input to ensure a comprehensive and transparent evaluation. Circumventing these processes undermines the integrity of the assessment and can lead to legal challenges and project delays due to unaddressed concerns. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach impact assessment by first thoroughly understanding the specific federal laws and guidelines applicable to the project's jurisdiction. This involves identifying the scope of the assessment, the types of impacts to be considered, and the required consultation processes. A systematic methodology, including baseline data collection, impact prediction, evaluation of significance, and development of mitigation strategies, should be employed. Professionals must maintain a critical mindset, constantly questioning assumptions and seeking comprehensive information. When faced with time pressures, the decision-making process should involve clear communication with the client about regulatory requirements and potential timelines, advocating for sufficient time to conduct a compliant and thorough assessment rather than compromising its quality. Ethical considerations, such as the duty to protect the environment and public health, must always guide the decision-making process. Question 10. Governance review demonstrates that a certified environmental site assessor has proposed a remedial action plan for a contaminated industrial site. The plan outlines specific cleanup targets and the chosen remediation technology. However, the plan lacks a detailed, site-specific operation and maintenance (O&M) strategy for the post-remediation phase, including defined performance monitoring, reporting schedules, and contingency measures for potential system failures or exceedances of cleanup goals. Which of the following approaches best reflects regulatory compliance and professional best practice for this scenario? Option A. Revise the remedial action plan to include a comprehensive, site-specific O&M strategy that integrates long-term monitoring, performance metrics, contingency planning, and a defined exit strategy, ensuring alignment with all applicable regulatory requirements for ongoing site management. Option B. Focus solely on achieving the immediate cleanup targets, as the regulatory framework primarily emphasizes initial remediation effectiveness over long-term operational considerations. Option C. Proceed with the remedial action as planned, deferring the development of the detailed O&M plan until after the initial cleanup is substantially complete. Option D. Select a remedial technology based primarily on its lower initial capital cost, assuming that O&M costs can be managed effectively once the system is operational. The correct answer is C. Proceed with the remedial action as planned, deferring the development of the detailed O&M plan until after the initial cleanup is substantially complete. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate need for effective contamination control with the long-term financial and technical sustainability of a remedial action. The assessor must navigate the complexities of regulatory requirements for both initial remediation and ongoing operation and maintenance, O&M, ensuring that the chosen approach is not only compliant at the outset, but also practical and enforceable over its intended lifespan. The potential for unforeseen site conditions or changes in regulatory standards adds further layers of complexity, demanding foresight and robust planning. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a comprehensive, phased strategy that integrates remedial design with a detailed, site-specific O&M plan. This aligns with the principles of environmental stewardship and regulatory compliance, ensuring that the chosen remedial technology is not only effective in the short term, but also manageable and sustainable in the long term. Specifically, it addresses the need for clear performance metrics, contingency planning for system failures or exceedances, and a defined exit strategy, all of which are critical for demonstrating ongoing compliance with environmental regulations and protecting human health and the environment. This proactive approach minimizes the risk of future liabilities and ensures the long-term integrity of the remediation effort. Incorrect approaches analysis. An approach that focuses solely on achieving immediate cleanup goals without a detailed O&M plan fails to meet regulatory requirements for long-term environmental protection. This is a regulatory failure because many environmental statutes mandate ongoing monitoring and maintenance to ensure that remedial objectives are sustained and that no new environmental risks emerge. Ethically, it represents a dereliction of duty by not adequately considering the post-remediation phase, potentially leaving the site vulnerable to future contamination or non-compliance. An approach that selects a remedial technology based primarily on initial cost, without a thorough assessment of its long-term O&M requirements, is also professionally unacceptable. This is a regulatory failure as it may lead to the selection of a system that cannot be operated and maintained within budget or technical capacity, thus jeopardizing compliance with performance standards. Ethically, it prioritizes short-term financial expediency over environmental protection and long-term site stewardship, potentially leading to ineffective remediation and future environmental harm. An approach that defers the development of a comprehensive O&M plan until after the initial remedial action is completed is a significant regulatory and ethical failing. This is a regulatory failure because effective O&M is intrinsically linked to the success of the remedial action itself and is often a prerequisite for regulatory closure or approval. Ethically, it demonstrates a lack of foresight and a failure to integrate all critical components of environmental management, increasing the likelihood of remedial system failure and ongoing environmental impact. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the site's contamination characteristics and the applicable regulatory framework. This involves identifying all relevant federal, state, and local environmental laws and guidelines pertaining to both remedial action and long-term O&M. The next step is to evaluate potential remedial technologies, not just for their immediate effectiveness and cost, but critically for their long-term operational and maintenance requirements, including staffing, equipment, monitoring, and disposal. A robust O&M plan should be developed concurrently with the remedial design, outlining specific performance standards, monitoring protocols, reporting requirements, and contingency measures. This integrated approach ensures that the chosen remedial action is technically sound, financially sustainable, and fully compliant with all regulatory obligations throughout its life cycle, including a clear exit strategy. Question 11. The risk matrix shows a high potential for groundwater contamination at a former industrial facility, with several chemicals identified as likely contaminants. However, the matrix's scoring for migration pathways is based on generalized assumptions rather than site-specific hydrogeological data. As a certified environmental site assessor tasked with identifying and prioritizing potential Superfund sites, which approach best aligns with the regulatory framework for Superfund site identification and prioritization under CERCLA. Option A. Conduct a detailed site-specific hydrogeological investigation to gather data that can be used to accurately score the site according to the Hazard Ranking System (HRS) guidance, and then use this to inform the prioritization process. Option B. Focus on the estimated remediation costs associated with the identified contaminants, prioritizing sites with the highest potential cleanup expenses for Superfund listing. Option C. Prioritize the site for immediate Superfund consideration based on the high contamination potential indicated by the risk matrix, assuming the generalized migration pathway assumptions are sufficiently conservative. Option D. Recommend deferral of Superfund consideration due to the uncertainty in the migration pathway data, suggesting further investigation be conducted by the responsible parties before any formal assessment. The correct answer is A. Conduct a detailed site-specific hydrogeological investigation to gather data that can be used to accurately score the site according to the Hazard Ranking System (HRS) guidance, and then use this to inform the prioritization process. Explanation. Scenario analysis. The scenario presents a challenge for a certified environmental site assessor (CESA) tasked with identifying and prioritizing potential Superfund sites. The core difficulty lies in translating a risk matrix, which often quantifies potential impacts and likelihoods, into actionable steps that align with the complex and often resource-constrained prioritization process mandated by the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act (CERCLA), commonly known as Superfund. CESA must navigate the inherent uncertainties in site data, the subjective nature of risk assessment, and the legal and regulatory framework that dictates how sites are evaluated and listed on the National Priorities List (NPL). The pressure to optimize the assessment process while ensuring regulatory compliance and public safety requires a nuanced understanding of both technical evaluation and administrative procedures. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach emphasizes a systematic review of the risk matrix against the specific criteria outlined in CERCLA and its implementing regulations, particularly the Hazard Ranking System (HRS) guidance. This involves a deep dive into the data supporting the risk matrix scores, verifying the presence and quality of information related to contaminant types, migration pathways, and potential receptors. The Assessor must then translate these findings into the HRS framework, which is the primary tool for scoring sites for NPL eligibility. This approach represents best professional practice because it directly addresses the regulatory mandate for site prioritization under CERCLA. It ensures that the assessment is grounded in the established scientific and legal standards, leading to a defensible prioritization that can withstand scrutiny and accurately reflect a site's potential threat to human health and the environment. Ethical considerations are met by prioritizing public health and environmental protection through rigorous adherence to the established regulatory process. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to solely rely on the risk matrix's numerical scores without a thorough validation against HRS criteria. This is a regulatory failure because the HRS is the definitive scoring mechanism for NPL consideration, and a risk matrix, while useful for internal assessment, may not perfectly align with HRS factors or may be based on assumptions not permissible under CERCLA. Ethically, this could lead to the misallocation of limited Superfund resources, either by prioritizing sites that do not meet HRS thresholds or by overlooking sites that do. Another incorrect approach would be to prioritize sites based on the perceived urgency or public outcry without a formal HRS evaluation. This is a regulatory failure as CERCLA mandates a standardized, science-based process for NPL listing. Public perception, while important, cannot supersede the legal requirements for site evaluation. Ethically, this approach risks creating a perception of favoritism or political influence in the Superfund process, undermining public trust and potentially diverting resources from sites with greater documented environmental hazards. A third incorrect approach would be to focus exclusively on the cost of remediation suggested by the risk matrix, using it as the primary driver for prioritization. While cost is a factor in overall Superfund program management, it is not the primary determinant for NPL listing. The HRS scoring is based on the potential for harm, not the estimated cost to clean up. This is a regulatory failure because it misinterprets the purpose of the HRS and the NPL. Ethically, it could lead to the deferral of high-risk sites if their remediation costs are perceived as too high, potentially exposing communities and the environment to prolonged contamination. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this situation should adopt a structured decision-making process that begins with a clear understanding of the regulatory objectives. This involves thoroughly reviewing the relevant statutes, CERCLA, and guidance documents, HRS guidance. The Assessor should then critically evaluate all available data, including the risk matrix, to determine its suitability and completeness for HRS scoring. If the risk matrix provides a useful starting point, the next step is to systematically translate its findings into the HRS framework, identifying any data gaps or discrepancies. This process requires a commitment to scientific integrity and regulatory compliance. When faced with ambiguous data or conflicting information, professionals should consult with regulatory agencies and seek clarification to ensure their assessment is accurate and defensible. The ultimate goal is to provide a recommendation that is both technically sound and legally compliant, prioritizing sites that pose the greatest threat to human health and the environment according to established federal standards. Question 12. Compliance review shows that a facility has a permitted emission unit that is currently not operating. The facility's records indicate the unit has been offline for the past 18 months due to a temporary production slowdown. There is no direct, real-time emissions monitoring data available for this unit during its non-operational period. The facility representative states that they intend to bring the unit back online in the next 6 months and will operate it in accordance with its existing air permit. What is the most appropriate initial step for the Certified Environmental Site Assessor to take to assess the unit's compliance status under the Clean Air Act? Option A. Compare the unit's historical operational data against general industry emission standards for similar equipment to determine potential compliance issues. Option B. Conclude that the unit is non-compliant with the Clean Air Act due to the absence of current operational emissions data. Option C. Verify the current status and any recent modifications or updates to the facility's air permit for the non-operating unit and confirm the facility's stated intent to operate in compliance. Option D. Assume the unit is non-compliant because it has been offline for an extended period without any active emissions. Correct answer is C. Verify the current status and any recent modifications or updates to the facility's air permit for the non-operating unit and confirm the facility's stated intent to operate in compliance. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge for environmental site assessors, balancing the need for accurate, up-to-date information with the practical constraints of site access and the evolving nature of regulatory compliance. The professional challenge lies in interpreting potentially conflicting data and making a defensible assessment of compliance status under the Clean Air Act, CA, without direct, current emissions data from a specific, non-operating unit. The assessor must rely on historical information, general industry standards, and the facility's own representations, all while acknowledging the inherent uncertainties. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly addresses the core of the compliance review, determining if the facility is meeting its CAA obligations. By focusing on the facility's stated intent to operate the unit in compliance with its existing permit, and by seeking confirmation of the permit's current status and any relevant updates or modifications, the assessor is gathering the most pertinent information available. This aligns with the CAA's emphasis on permitting as the primary mechanism for controlling emissions and ensuring compliance. The assessor is also demonstrating due diligence by acknowledging the lack of direct emissions data and proposing a path forward that involves verification and potential further investigation if discrepancies arise. This proactive and investigative stance is crucial for providing a reliable assessment. An incorrect approach that relies solely on the absence of current operational data to declare noncompliance is professionally unacceptable. This fails to acknowledge that a unit may be temporarily offline, but still subject to permit requirements and operational standards. It also overlooks the possibility that the facility may have implemented measures to maintain compliance even during non-operation. Ethically, it could lead to an unfounded accusation of noncompliance, potentially damaging the facility's reputation and leading to unnecessary regulatory scrutiny. Another incorrect approach that focuses on general industry emission standards without referencing the specific permit for the unit in question is also flawed. While general standards provide context, the CAA's permitting program is designed to establish site-specific emission limits and control requirements. Relying on generic data bypasses the regulatory framework that governs the facility and its operations, leading to an inaccurate and potentially misleading assessment. This represents a failure to adhere to the specific regulatory requirements of the CAA. A third incorrect approach that assumes the unit is non-compliant due to its non-operational status without any further investigation is professionally unsound. This is a presumption rather than an assessment. It fails to consider that the unit might be undergoing maintenance, awaiting reactivation, or that its non-operational status is temporary and managed in accordance with regulatory requirements. This approach lacks the analytical rigor expected of a certified environmental site assessor and could lead to an erroneous conclusion. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Understanding the specific regulatory framework, in this case, the CAA and its implementing regulations. 2. Identifying the key compliance obligations relevant to the facility and the specific unit. 3. Gathering all available information, including historical data, permits, operational records, and facility representations. 4. Critically evaluating the completeness and reliability of the gathered information. 5. Identifying any data gaps or uncertainties. 6. Developing a strategy to address these gaps, which may involve further investigation, verification, or consultation with regulatory agencies. 7. Formulating a defensible conclusion based on the totality of the evidence, clearly articulating any assumptions or limitations. Question 13. The audit findings indicate elevated levels of particulate matter, PM2.5, detected by a nearby monitoring station, potentially exceeding the National Ambient Air Quality Standards (NOx). As a certified environmental site assessor, which of the following actions is the most appropriate initial step to address these findings? Option A. Advise the client to immediately implement advanced emission control technologies for the facility, as the detected levels suggest a significant environmental impact. Option B. Review the manufacturing facility's existing air pollution control permits to determine if their operational limits are being met, assuming this is the primary cause of the elevated readings. Option C. Initiate a comprehensive site-specific air quality monitoring program to collect data on PM2. 5 concentrations and compare these findings directly against the current NOx as defined in 40 CFR Part 50. Option D. Rely on general knowledge of the region's air quality and the facility's historical compliance record to conclude that the elevated readings are likely transient and do not warrant further investigation. The correct answer is C. Initiate a comprehensive site-specific air quality monitoring program to collect data on PM2.5 concentrations and compare these findings directly against the current NOx as defined in 40 CFR Part 50. Explanation: the audit findings indicate a potential noncompliance with National Ambient Air Quality Standards, NOx, due to elevated particulate matter levels near a manufacturing facility. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the Certified Environmental Site Assessor, CESA, to interpret complex air quality data, understand the nuances of NOx regulations, and determine the most appropriate course of action to ensure environmental protection and regulatory adherence. The CESA must balance the need for accurate assessment with the practicalities of site investigation and reporting. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly addresses the potential NOx exceedance by initiating a detailed investigation to confirm the source and extent of the elevated particulate matter. This involves collecting site-specific data, comparing it against the relevant NOx for the specific pollutant, and consulting the Code of Federal Regulations, CFR, Title 40, specifically Parts 50 and 58, which outline the primary and secondary standards and the monitoring requirements. This methodical approach ensures that any conclusions are data-driven and legally defensible, aligning with the CESA ethical obligation to provide accurate and thorough assessments. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the facility's operational permits without verifying actual ambient conditions fails to address the core issue of potential NOx exceedance. Regulatory permits are a snapshot of intended operations, not a guarantee of ambient air quality. This approach is ethically flawed as it bypasses the direct mandate to assess ambient air quality against established standards. Another incorrect approach that dismisses the findings based on general knowledge of the area's air quality is professionally negligent. Ambient air quality can fluctuate significantly due to various factors, and anecdotal evidence is insufficient for regulatory compliance. This demonstrates a failure to adhere to the scientific rigor required for environmental assessments. A third incorrect approach that immediately recommends costly, speculative mitigation measures without a confirmed exceedance is premature and unprofessional. It bypasses the critical step of data verification and analysis, potentially leading to unnecessary expenditures and misallocation of resources. This is an ethical failure as it does not prioritize a fact-based, evidence-driven assessment. Professional decision-making in such situations requires a systematic process. First, thoroughly understand the reported findings and the relevant regulatory framework, NOx, CFR Title 40. Second, plan and execute a targeted investigation to collect relevant data. Third, analyze the collected data against the established standards. Fourth, consult with regulatory agencies if the data indicates a potential exceedance or if clarification is needed. Finally, report findings and recommendations clearly and factually, adhering to all professional and ethical standards. Question 14. The evaluation methodology shows a proposed reduction in the scope of a Phase I environmental site assessment, specifically by omitting the review of historical aerial photographs and Sanborn fire insurance maps, with the client citing cost saving as the primary driver. Which of the following represents the most appropriate professional response for a certified environmental site assessor? Option A. Conduct a limited historical records review focusing only on readily available online databases, assuming that any significant historical issues would be documented there. Option B. Inform the client that omitting these critical historical records is contrary to ASTM E1527-13 and best professional practice, explaining the potential risks of an incomplete assessment, and recommend proceeding with the full scope to ensure compliance and adequate risk identification. Option C. Advise the client that while these records are typically reviewed, their omission is acceptable if the client signs a waiver absolving the assessor of liability for any environmental issues that may arise from historical uses not identified due to the reduced scope. Option D. Proceed with the reduced scope as requested by the client, documenting the client's instruction and the rationale for the omission. The correct answer is D. Proceed with the reduced scope as requested by the client, documenting the client's instruction and the rationale for the omission. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge for certified environmental site assessors, CESA, where a client, driven by cost-saving imperatives, requests a deviation from established best practice methodologies. The challenge lies in balancing the client's financial interest with the assessor's professional obligation to conduct thorough and compliant site assessments, ensuring the integrity of the environmental data and the accuracy of the final report. Failing to adhere to recognized standards can lead to incomplete or misleading assessments, potentially resulting in significant future liabilities for the client and reputational damage for the CESA. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a comprehensive evaluation of the site's historical and current environmental conditions, utilizing a phased approach that includes a records review, site reconnaissance, and interviews with current and past owners/operators. This aligns with the principles of ASTM E1527-13, Standard Practice for Environmental Site Assessments, Phase I Environmental Site Assessment Process, which is the de facto standard for Phase I ESAs in the United States and is often mandated by lenders and regulatory bodies. This methodology ensures that potential or existing environmental conditions are identified, characterized, and documented, forming the basis for informed decision-making. Adherence to this standard is a cornerstone of professional practice, fulfilling ethical duties to clients and regulatory requirements. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves solely relying on a visual inspection of the property without conducting a thorough historical records review or interviewing relevant parties. This fails to identify historical uses of the property that may have led to contamination, even if current visible signs are absent. This approach violates the fundamental principles of ASTM E1527-13 and regulatory expectations for a comprehensive Phase I ESA, potentially leading to the overlooking of significant environmental risks. Another incorrect approach is to limit the records review to only readily available public records, neglecting to investigate historical aerial photographs, fire insurance maps, building department records, or other relevant historical documents. Selective review can miss critical information about past activities, such as underground storage tanks or past chemical storage, which are vital for identifying recognized environmental conditions. REC. This selective approach is a direct contravention of the thoroughness required by best practice standards. A third incorrect approach is to dismiss potential environmental concerns based on the client's assertion that no contamination exists, without independent verification through the prescribed assessment process. This prioritizes the client's subjective opinion over objective data collection and analysis, compromising the integrity of the assessment. It represents a failure to exercise independent professional judgment and a potential ethical breach by not conducting a truly objective evaluation. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such situations by first understanding the client's objectives and constraints. However, they must then clearly articulate the regulatory and professional requirements for a compliant Phase I ESA, explaining the rationale behind each component of the standard methodology. If a client requests a reduced scope, the CESA must explain the potential risks and liabilities associated with such a deviation, emphasizing that a non-compliant assessment may not satisfy lender requirements or regulatory obligations. The decision-making process should involve a risk-benefit analysis, where the potential cost savings for the client are weighed against the increased risk of undetected environmental liabilities and the potential professional repercussions for the CESA. Ultimately, the CESA professional responsibility is to conduct a thorough and compliant assessment, even if it means advising the client against a cost-saving measure that compromises the integrity of the evaluation. Question 15. Process analysis reveals that a property with a history of industrial manufacturing may require future remediation or redevelopment. To ensure comprehensive due diligence and advise the client effectively on potential future environmental obligations, what is the most prudent approach regarding permitting requirements? Option A. Assume no permits are immediately required as no active remediation or construction is currently planned for the site. Option B. Rely on general industry knowledge of common environmental permits without consulting specific regulatory agency guidance or application requirements. Option C. Focus solely on federal environmental permits as these are typically the most comprehensive and overarching. Option D. Proactively identify and research all potentially applicable federal, state, and local environmental permits that might be required for any future remediation or redevelopment activities, and consult with relevant regulatory agencies. The correct answer is D. Proactively identify and research all potentially applicable federal, state, and local environmental permits that might be required for any future remediation or redevelopment activities, and consult with relevant regulatory agencies. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge for environmental site assessors, ESSA, where a property's historical use suggests potential contamination, but the current permitting landscape for remediation or redevelopment is unclear. The professional challenge lies in navigating the ambiguity of regulatory requirements for a site that may require intervention, balancing the need for thorough due diligence with the practicalities of project initiation, and the potential for unforeseen permitting hurdles. Accurate assessment of permitting requirements is crucial to avoid project delays, cost overruns, and noncompliance. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves proactively identifying all potentially applicable federal, state, and local environmental permits that might be required for any future remediation or redevelopment activities. This includes understanding the scope of work anticipated, the types of contaminants suspected, and the proposed methods for management or disposal. By engaging with regulatory agencies early and thoroughly researching all relevant permit categories, e.g., air emission, wastewater discharge, hazardous waste management, land use, construction, the ESA ensures that the client is fully informed of the permitting pathway, potential timelines, and associated costs. This proactive stance aligns with the ethical obligation to provide comprehensive and accurate advice, minimizing future risks, and facilitating a smoother project progression. It directly addresses the core mandate of an ESA to identify and assess environmental conditions and their regulatory implications. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume that no permits are immediately required because no active remediation or construction is currently planned. This fails to acknowledge that future activities, even if not immediate, will necessitate permits. The regulatory framework often requires pre-application discussions and planning, and delaying this consideration can lead to significant project delays and penalties. It represents a failure to conduct thorough due diligence regarding potential future liabilities and compliance obligations. Another incorrect approach is to only consider federal permits and overlook state or local requirements. Environmental regulations are often layered, with state and local agencies having authority over specific aspects of environmental protection and land use. Ignoring these can lead to noncompliance with crucial local ordinances or state-specific programs that may be more stringent than federal mandates. This demonstrates a lack of comprehensive understanding of the regulatory landscape. A third incorrect approach is to rely solely on general industry knowledge without consulting specific regulatory agency guidance or permit application forms. While industry experience is valuable, specific permit requirements can vary significantly between agencies and even between different programs within the same agency. This can lead to an incomplete or inaccurate assessment of what is truly required, potentially causing the client to miss critical steps in the permitting process. This approach risks providing advice that is not grounded in the precise legal and administrative requirements. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic approach to permitting requirements. This involves 1. Understanding the client's objectives and the site's history to anticipate potential future activities. 2. Conducting a comprehensive review of all relevant federal, state, and local environmental statutes, regulations, and agency guidance documents. 3. Identifying all potential permit categories that could be triggered by anticipated activities. 4. Engaging in early consultation with relevant regulatory agencies to clarify requirements and expectations. And 5. Clearly documenting all findings and recommendations for the client, including potential timelines and costs associated with permitting. This structured process ensures thoroughness, accuracy, and proactive risk management. Question 16. Quality control measures reveal that a certified environmental site assessor has identified several minor exceedances of regulatory standards for a particular contaminant during a Phase I environmental site assessment. The client, a property developer, expresses concern about the potential cost and delay associated with addressing these exceedances, and suggests that only significant findings be included in the final report. The assessor is aware that these minor exceedances, while not immediately posing a severe risk, could indicate a developing issue or contribute to cumulative environmental impact. What is the most appropriate course of action for the assessor to take? Option A. Document all findings, including the minor exceedances, in the report and provide a professional recommendation for further investigation or appropriate remediation based on regulatory requirements and best environmental practices. Option B. Advise the client that the decision on whether to report the minor exceedances rests solely with them, without offering a professional recommendation. Option C. Recommend only the minimum legally mandated action for the identified minor exceedances, even if professional judgment suggests a more comprehensive approach would be more effective. Option D. Omit the minor exceedances from the report to avoid alarming the client and to maintain a positive client relationship, focusing only on the major findings. The correct answer is A. Document all findings, including the minor exceedances, in the report and provide a professional recommendation for further investigation or appropriate remediation based on regulatory requirements and best environmental practices. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it involves a direct conflict between a client's desire to minimize immediate costs and the assessor's ethical and regulatory obligation to accurately report findings and recommend appropriate remediation. The assessor must navigate the potential for financial repercussions from the client while upholding professional integrity and ensuring compliance with environmental regulations. The pressure to downplay findings for client satisfaction is a common ethical dilemma in environmental consulting. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach of documenting all findings, including minor exceedances, and providing a clear, evidence-based recommendation for further investigation or remediation represents best professional practice. This aligns with the core principles of the Certified Environmental Site Assessor (CESA) certification, which emphasizes thoroughness, accuracy, and adherence to regulatory standards. Specifically, it upholds the CESA duty to protect public health and the environment by ensuring that all potential environmental risks are identified and addressed according to applicable regulations, such as those enforced by the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, under CERCLA or ARCRA, depending on the nature of the contamination. This approach ensures transparency with regulatory bodies and provides the client with the necessary information for informed decision-making, thereby mitigating future liability. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves omitting minor exceedances from the report to avoid alarming the client and potentially losing future business. This is a direct violation of professional ethics and regulatory requirements. It constitutes a failure to accurately represent the site conditions, which can lead to significant environmental harm and legal repercussions for both the assessor and the client. Ethically, it breaches the duty of honesty and integrity. Legally, it can be construed as misrepresentation or even fraud, potentially violating statutes like the Clean Water Act or state-specific environmental laws if the exceedances pose a risk to water bodies. Another incorrect approach is to recommend only the minimum legally required action for the identified exceedances, even if professional judgment suggests a more comprehensive or proactive remediation strategy would be more effective in the long term. This approach prioritizes expediency and cost saving over environmental protection and long-term risk management. It fails to exercise due diligence and can lead to recurring issues, increased costs down the line, and potential noncompliance if the minimum action proves insufficient. This demonstrates a lack of professional responsibility to provide the best possible advice for environmental stewardship. A third incorrect approach is to defer the decision on reporting minor exceedances entirely to the client, without providing a professional recommendation. While client consultation is important, the assessor has a professional obligation to advise on the significance of findings and their regulatory implications. Shifting this responsibility abdicates the assessor's expertise and ethical duty to guide the client towards responsible environmental practices and regulatory compliance. This can lead to the client making an uninformed decision that compromises environmental safety and regulatory adherence. Professional reasoning Professionals in this field must adopt a decision-making process that prioritizes regulatory compliance, ethical conduct, and the protection of human health and the environment. This involves a systematic approach. 1. Understand the applicable regulatory framework thoroughly. 2. Conduct a comprehensive site assessment, meticulously documenting all findings, regardless of perceived significance. 3. Analyze all findings against relevant regulatory standards and guidelines. 4. Formulate clear, evidence-based recommendations for action, considering both immediate and long-term environmental and financial implications. 5. Communicate findings and recommendations transparently and professionally to the client, explaining the rationale and potential consequences of different courses of action. 6. Maintain professional independence and integrity, resisting pressure to compromise findings or recommendations for client convenience or financial gain. Question 17. Compliance review shows that a Phase II environmental site assessment (ESSA) was conducted at a former industrial facility. The Phase I ESA identified several potential sources of contamination, including underground storage tanks (UST) and areas of historical chemical storage. The Phase II sampling plan, however, involved collecting soil samples on a uniform 50-foot grid across the entire property, regardless of the proximity to the identified potential sources. Which approach best reflects regulatory compliance and professional best practice for this Phase II ESA? Option A. The grid-based sampling approach is acceptable as it ensures comprehensive coverage of the entire property, minimizing the risk of missing any contamination. Option B. The sampling plan should focus only on areas where visual evidence of contamination was present during the site reconnaissance for the Phase II ESA. Option C. The assessor should have relied solely on the historical data from the Phase I ESA to determine the extent of potential contamination without conducting new sampling. Option D. The sampling plan should have been designed to target specific areas of concern identified in the Phase I ESA, such as around the USDs and historical chemical storage areas, with a rationale for the sampling locations and depths based on the conceptual site model. The correct answer is D. The sampling plan should have been designed to target specific areas of concern identified in the Phase I ESA, such as around the USDs and historical chemical storage areas, with a rationale for the sampling locations and depths based on the conceptual site model. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in environmental consulting, balancing the need for thoroughness in a Phase II environmental site assessment (ESSA) with the practical constraints of project scope and client objectives. The challenge lies in determining the appropriate level of investigation to satisfy regulatory requirements and client expectations without incurring unnecessary costs or delays. The assessor must exercise professional judgment to identify potential contaminant pathways and sources, and then design a sampling strategy that is both scientifically sound and cost-effective. The risk of under-investigation leading to future liability or over-investigation leading to wasted resources necessitates a carefully considered approach. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic process of data evaluation and targeted sampling. It begins with a thorough review of the Phase I ESA findings to identify potential areas of concern and relevant environmental media. Based on this, a conceptual site model is developed, outlining potential contaminant sources, migration pathways, and receptors. The sampling plan is then designed to directly address the identified uncertainties and potential risks, focusing on areas where contamination is most likely to be present. This approach is best professional practice because it is directly aligned with regulatory expectations for Phase II ESAs, which mandate the investigation of recognized environmental conditions. It ensures that the investigation is scientifically defensible, provides sufficient data to assess potential risks, and informs decisions regarding further action or closure. This targeted methodology minimizes unnecessary sampling, thereby controlling costs while still meeting regulatory compliance and client needs. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves conducting a broad, grid-based sampling program across the entire property without specific justification from the Phase I ESA. This approach fails to demonstrate a clear understanding of potential contaminant sources or migration pathways, leading to inefficient use of resources and potentially missing localized areas of concern. It is a failure of professional judgment and regulatory compliance, as it does not demonstrate a risk-based approach to site assessment. Another incorrect approach is to limit sampling to only the most obvious or easily accessible areas, neglecting less apparent but potentially significant sources or pathways identified in the Phase I ESA. This approach risks overlooking critical contamination, leaving the client exposed to future liability, and failing to meet the regulatory requirement of thoroughly investigating recognized environmental conditions. It represents a failure to exercise due diligence and a disregard for potential environmental impacts. A third incorrect approach is to rely solely on historical data without any current sampling, especially if the historical data is outdated or does not cover the specific contaminants of concern. While historical data is valuable, it may not reflect current site conditions or the full spectrum of potential contaminants. This approach fails to provide the necessary current data to assess the site's environmental status and can lead to non-compliance with regulatory requirements for up-to-date assessments. Professional reasoning. Professionals undertaking a Phase II ESA should adopt a risk-based, data-driven approach. This involves 1. Thoroughly reviewing all available information, particularly the Phase I ESA report, to identify potential environmental concerns. 2. Developing a conceptual site model to understand potential contaminant behavior. 3. Designing a sampling and analysis plan that directly addresses the identified uncertainties and potential risks, focusing on areas of highest concern. 4. Continuously evaluating data as it becomes available and adjusting the sampling plan if necessary. 5. Documenting all decisions and justifications clearly. This systematic process ensures that the investigation is both effective and efficient, meeting regulatory obligations and protecting client interests. Question 18. Benchmark analysis indicates that a client is requesting expedited completion of a Phase II environmental site assessment, urging the environmental site assessor to bypass the standard soil sampling protocol for volatile organic compounds, VOC, by using a less rigorous field screening method for initial assessment, with the promise of conducting full laboratory analysis only if the field screening results are positive. The assessor is aware that the standard protocol involves collecting discrete soil samples at specific depths and intervals for laboratory analysis, regardless of field screening results, to ensure comprehensive data for regulatory compliance and liability assessment. Option A. Proceed with the client's requested field screening method as the primary sampling technique for VOCs, and only collect laboratory samples if the field screening indicates potential contamination. Option B. Inform the client that the standard soil sampling protocol for VOCs must be followed as per regulatory requirements and best professional practice, ensuring laboratory analysis of all collected samples to maintain data integrity and defensibility, and explain the risks associated with deviating from these protocols. Option C. Utilize the field screening method for all VOC sampling and document the results as preliminary data, advising the client that these results are not sufficient for regulatory submission or liability determination without subsequent laboratory analysis. Option D. Conduct the field screening as requested, but also collect a reduced number of discrete soil samples for laboratory analysis from locations where field screening results are negative, to provide some level of confirmation. The correct answer is A. Proceed with the client's requested field screening method as the primary sampling technique for VOCs, and only collect laboratory samples if the field screening indicates potential contamination. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between expediency and the rigorous requirements of environmental sampling protocols. The assessor is pressured to deviate from established procedures to meet a client's timeline, which directly impacts the integrity and defensibility of the collected data. Careful judgment is required to balance client needs with the ethical and regulatory obligations of an environmental professional. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes adherence to the established sampling techniques and protocols mandated by the relevant regulatory framework. This ensures that the data collected is scientifically sound, representative of site conditions, and legally defensible. Following approved methods, such as those outlined in EPA guidance or state-specific regulations for Phase I and Phase II environmental site assessments, is crucial for meeting the objectives of the assessment and informing subsequent decisions regarding potential environmental liabilities. Maintaining chain of custody and proper sample preservation are non-negotiable aspects of this best practice. An incorrect approach that involves collecting samples without proper documentation of the sampling location, or without adhering to the specified preservation techniques, would represent a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This would violate fundamental principles of environmental data collection, rendering the results unreliable and potentially inadmissible in legal or regulatory proceedings. Such a deviation undermines the purpose of the assessment and exposes the assessor and their client to increased risk. Another incorrect approach, such as using non-standard sampling equipment without justification or validation, would also be a regulatory failure. This could introduce bias or contamination, compromising the representativeness of the samples and the validity of the analytical results. Ethically, it demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for professional standards. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the applicable regulatory requirements and ethical codes of conduct. When faced with client pressure or perceived time constraints, the assessor must first identify the specific protocols that are being asked to be bypassed. They should then clearly communicate the potential consequences of noncompliance, including the impact on data quality, defensibility, and regulatory acceptance. If the client insists on a deviation, the assessor must be prepared to decline the request or to document the deviation and its potential implications thoroughly, while still striving to achieve the most scientifically sound outcome possible under the circumstances. The ultimate responsibility for ensuring data integrity rests with the environmental professional. Question 19. The monitoring system demonstrates the presence of historical fill material and potential subsurface anomalies, and Sanborn fire insurance maps from the early 20th century indicate a former industrial use on an adjacent property that has since been redeveloped. Which of the following approaches best addresses the potential environmental impact of this historical industrial activity on the subject property? Option A. Conduct a broad, non-targeted soil and groundwater sampling program across the entire subject property without specific reference to historical data. Option B. Rely solely on current site reconnaissance and visual inspection, as historical maps are not definitive indicators of present-day contamination. Option C. Conduct targeted soil and groundwater sampling in areas identified by the Sanborn maps as potentially impacted, and analyze for contaminants consistent with the historical industrial use. Option D. Dismiss the Sanborn maps as outdated and focus exclusively on current zoning regulations and building permits for the subject property. The correct answer is C. Conduct targeted soil and groundwater sampling in areas identified by the Sanborn maps as potentially impacted, and analyze for contaminants consistent with the historical industrial use. Explanation. The monitoring system demonstrates the presence of historical fill material and potential subsurface anomalies. This scenario is professionally challenging because the interpretation of Sanborn fire insurance maps, while a valuable tool for identifying historical land use and potential contamination sources, is not definitive. These maps provide a snapshot in time and may not capture all relevant details or changes that have occurred since their creation. A certified environmental site assessor, CESA, must exercise careful judgment in integrating this historical data with current site conditions and other investigative findings. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it involves a systematic and evidence-based methodology. It prioritizes the use of Sanborn maps to inform the scope of further investigation, specifically targeting areas indicated by the maps as potentially impacted. This aligns with regulatory expectations for a thorough Phase I environmental site assessment, ESSA, which requires the identification and evaluation of recognized environmental conditions, REC. By using the maps to guide targeted sampling and analysis, the assessor is efficiently and effectively addressing potential risks, fulfilling their ethical obligation to conduct a comprehensive assessment. This approach is consistent with the principles of due diligence and the ASTM E1527 standard, which is often referenced in regulatory frameworks for Phase I ESAs. An incorrect approach that relies solely on the visual presence of fill material without further investigation fails to adequately assess potential contamination. This is a regulatory failure because it bypasses the requirement to investigate potential sources and pathways of contamination indicated by historical records. Ethically, it represents a failure to exercise due diligence and could lead to an incomplete assessment, potentially exposing future parties to unforeseen environmental liabilities. Another incorrect approach that dismisses the Sanborn maps entirely because they are historical documents is also a regulatory and ethical failure. Historical, these maps are a critical component of identifying past activities that may have led to contamination. Ignoring them means potentially overlooking significant RECs, which is a direct contravention of the principles of a thorough phase IESA. This approach demonstrates a lack of understanding of how historical data informs current risk assessment. A third incorrect approach that focuses only on current surface conditions, disregarding the historical context provided by the Sanborn maps, is also professionally unacceptable. This overlooks the potential for historical releases of hazardous substances that may have migrated into the subsurface and are not immediately apparent on the surface. This is a regulatory failure, as it neglects a key component of historical site research and an ethical failure to conduct a comprehensive assessment. The professional reasoning process for similar situations involves a hierarchical approach to information gathering and analysis. First, gather all available historical information, including Sanborn maps, aerial photographs, and chain of title reports. Second, correlate this historical information with current site conditions through visual inspection and interviews. Third, use the combined historical and current data to identify potential RECs. Fourth, develop a sampling and analysis plan that specifically targets areas of concern identified in the previous steps. Finally, interpret the analytical results in the context of the historical information and regulatory standards to reach a conclusion about the presence or absence of environmental impacts. Question 20. Assessment of a property transaction where the buyer is seeking to qualify for the innocent landowner defense under CERCLA. What is the most appropriate course of action for an environmental site assessor to recommend if the Phase I environmental site assessment identifies recognized environmental conditions, REC, related to historical industrial operations on the property? Option A. Suggest relying solely on the seller's representation that the property is free from environmental contamination. Option B. Inform the buyer that contamination predating their ownership automatically exempts them from CERCLA liability. Option C. Advise the buyer that the absence of direct personal knowledge of contamination at the time of purchase is sufficient to establish the innocent landowner defense. Option D. Recommend a Phase II environmental site assessment to investigate the nature and extent of the RECs. Correct answer is D. Recommend a Phase II environmental site assessment to investigate the nature and extent of the RECs. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an assessor to navigate the complexities of CERCLA liability, specifically the innocent landowner defense, in the context of historical land use and the discovery of contamination. The assessor must distinguish between actual knowledge of contamination at the time of acquisition and constructive knowledge, which can arise from the exercise of appropriate care. The challenge lies in interpreting the scope of appropriate care and how it relates to the all appropriate inquiries standard under CERCLA. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly addresses the statutory requirements for establishing the innocent landowner defense. By conducting a thorough Phase I environmental site assessment ESSA that meets the ASTM E1527 standard, or equivalent EPA-recognized standard, the assessor demonstrates the exercise of all appropriate inquiries. This process is designed to identify potential or existing environmental contamination liabilities. If the Phase I ESA reveals recognized environmental conditions, REC, the next step is a Phase II ESA to confirm the presence and extent of contamination. This systematic, evidence-based approach aligns with CERCLA intent to allow landowners to avoid liability if they can prove they had no knowledge of the contamination and exercised appropriate care. This is ethically sound as it promotes due diligence and protects parties who acquire contaminated property without prior knowledge or fault. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the absence of direct, personal knowledge of contamination at the time of purchase fails to meet the all appropriate inquiries standard. CERCLA liability can attach even without direct knowledge if a reasonable person would have discovered the contamination through due diligence. This approach ignores the statutory requirement for proactive investigation. Another incorrect approach that relies on the seller's assurances without independent verification is also professionally unacceptable. While seller representations are part of due diligence, they are not a substitute for the assessor's own investigation. This approach risks overlooking contamination that the seller may not be aware of or may be intentionally concealing, leading to potential CERCLA liability for the buyer. A third incorrect approach that assumes no liability simply because the contamination predates the current ownership is flawed. CERCLA liability scheme is broad and can extend to current owners of contaminated sites, regardless of when the release occurred, unless specific defenses are met. This approach fails to acknowledge the potential for ongoing or continuing releases and the responsibilities of current landowners. The professional decision-making process for similar situations involves a structured, risk-based approach. First, understand the relevant regulatory framework, CERCLA in this case, and its specific defenses. Second, meticulously follow established due diligence standards, such as ASTM E1527, to conduct all appropriate inquiries. Third, critically evaluate the findings of the Phase I ESA, identifying RECs. Fourth, if RECs are present, recommend and oversee appropriate Phase II investigations to characterize the contamination. Finally, advise the client on potential liabilities and strategies for mitigation or defense based on the comprehensive findings.